All right, Cardinals fans, we need to talk about this run defense. If you followed the Arizona Cardinals this year, you probably know that their biggest weakness thus far has been their run defense. Simply put, they've given up a lot of rushing yards throughout the season with a few exceptions. So in this video, I'm going to look at the Cardinals rushing defense and try to get an idea of what's going on here. So buckle up, this is going to be a little bit of a deep dive. When you look at team statistics, the Cardinals rank 22nd in rushing yards per game, giving up just over 120 yards per game. They're 31st in yards per attempt average, allowing 4.9 yards per attempt. But paradoxically, their rushing DVOA, a metric by Football Outsiders, is ranked 7th in the league. Now, this DVOA metric is a weighted metric that takes other things into account besides just yards. So how is it that this Cardinals rushing defense that rates so poorly in terms of yards per game and yards per attempt allowed has a pretty good DVOA against the run? I'm going to come back to this question later in the video because I think I might have an answer. Before we get into the analysis, we need to understand that there are really 3 ways that a team can stop another team from running the ball. One way is to create a defensive alignment that makes it difficult for the opposing team to run the ball. This is sometimes called stacking the box. You get multiple defenders along the defensive line and in the linebacker area, and essentially try to outnumber the blockers so that you can get to the running back and bring them down. The second way is to have players who are good against the run. Players who are effective at shooting gaps, disengaging from blocks, disrupting plays in the backfield, and making the tackle. If you have players who are good against the run like this, you may not have to stack the box as much to stop the run. Now, unfortunately, when we look at the PFF run defense grade for the Arizona Cardinals starting defenders this season, we find that they don't actually seem to fare well against the run individually. You see that Marcus Golden, Budda Baker, and J.J. Watt have graded reasonably well, but the rest of our starters have graded mediocre at best, and some players like Chandler Jones and Zach Allen have graded very poorly against the run. Now, with the uncertainty surrounding J.J. Watt's injury, and the fact that he was one of our better defenders against the run, that certainly is a reason for concern. The good news is there are some players in the Cardinals rotation who are better against the run. When you look at players like Zaven Collins, Devon Kennard, Jordan Phillips, Dennis Gardeck, and Antonio Hamilton, you see PFF run defense grades are actually pretty good. And with Jordan Phillips likely to step in and play significant snaps, hopefully he can help bolster that defensive line. But overall, the Cardinals' run defense grades don't suggest we have many players who are really good individually against the run. Budda Baker and J.J. Watt I think are pretty good. Zaven Collins shows a lot of promise. But overall, the Cardinals do seem to grade poorly in this regard, which means they are likely going to have to depend more on personnel, stacking the box in order to stop the run. But there's also a third way that the Cardinals have been able to stop the run, and this is game script. In short, if you can build a sizable lead, especially in the second half, opposing offenses are going to have to abandon the run and try to pass to get back in the game. But this is predicated on your offense putting up points. And as we've seen this year, the Cardinals have overall been good at doing that. So to prepare for this video, I took a close look at the Cardinals' run defensive snaps. I looked at every running play with the exception of quarterback runs, because those have a different dynamic to them. They're often pass plays that have broken down, and often it's not fair to put on the run defense if a quarterback scrambles on what was otherwise a passing play. But I looked at each of those non-quarterback running plays and recorded how many players the Cardinals had in the box for those plays. And then from there, I did some other analyses of yards allowed and things like that. So we're going to look at what I found from this analysis. Now, I divided the plays up by whether they had 6 or fewer defenders in the box, 7 defenders in the box, or 8 or more defenders in the box. Now, the 8 or more category also included all goal line defenses. And you see that they had 61 snaps using 6 or fewer men in the box, which was 38.9% of their run defense snaps. And in these fronts, they gave up 375 yards, for an average of 6.1 yards per carry. They had 69 snaps where they had 7 defenders in the box, which was a total of 43.9% of those run defense snaps. They gave up 338 yards for an average of 4.9 yards per carry. But when you look at those snaps where the Cardinals stacked the box with 8 defenders, you see a much different picture. Now, though they only did this 27 times for 17.2% of their snaps, they only gave up 45 yards for an average of 1.7 yards per carry. Now, if you take out the goal line carries, because many of those may only have 1 yard available to gain, they still only gave up 2 yards per carry when they had 8 men in the box. And altogether, when you add it up, you see they gave up 758 yards and averaged 4.8 yards per carry allowed. Now, unfortunately, the Cardinals can't stack the box every play. That opens up your pass defense to be exposed. So inevitably, the Cardinals had to pick and choose their spots for having 8 men in the box. And when you have fewer defenders in the box, in order to stop the run, you often need to rely on a playmaker to do something to break up that play, despite having disadvantage in terms of the numbers game. But as we saw earlier, the Cardinals' run defense grades suggest that this isn't something they can do consistently, which is probably why we see such a drop-off in terms of their ability to stop the run when we go to 7 or 6 defenders in the box. Now, obviously, you do expect there to be some drop-off there, but it does seem that there's quite a bit of drop-off between 8 and 7 defenders. Now, when you look at these data a little more closely on a game-by-game basis, there's some other narratives that emerge. Each game sort of had its own game script, and those narratives are telling about the Cardinals' run defense overall. So we're going to look at each of those games individually, examine how the Cardinals approached the defensive fronts, how the game scripts worked out, and what the results were. The Cardinals' Week 1 game against the Tennessee Titans, keeping Derrick Henry in check, is arguably the Cardinals' best performance of the season thus far in terms of run defense. Now, they did give up fewer yards and yards per carry against Houston, but Derrick Henry and that Titans offense is much better than the Houston Texans running game. But when you look at their personnel, you notice something. The Cardinals lined up 8 or more defenders in the box 30% of the time. And when you look in the first quarter, you see that the Cardinals went with 7 or 8 defenders in the box for every running down. And you see the results. They stopped Derrick Henry in his tracks. But when you look at the second half, you see that the Cardinals went with 6 players in the box for every running snap. And indeed, Derrick Henry had more success running the ball in the second half. But at this point in the game, the Cardinals had built up such a lead that those rushing yards really didn't matter. The Titans weren't getting back into the game by running the ball. So really, when you look at it, the Cardinals were able to stop Derrick Henry because they committed to getting more defenders in the box in the first and second quarter. But they were also able to play good passing defense, because if you can't stop the pass, this strategy is going to backfire. And indeed, the Cardinals were able to win this game in blowout fashion. Week 2 against the Minnesota Vikings is where the Cardinals' issues in run defense started to become evident. Now, they didn't stack the box with 8 or more defenders nearly as often. In fact, they only had 3 plays with this kind of front. And in those plays, they did hold the Vikings to a total of -1 yards on those 3 attempts. But unlike the Titans, the Vikings were able to run effectively on those 7-man fronts. And this is really where that playmaking, or lack of playmaking, came to bear. Dalvin Cook had an outstanding game, making people miss, and the Cardinals defenders really struggled to wrap him up. And as we know, this game came down to a missed field goal by the Minnesota Vikings. Now, the Week 3 game against the Jacksonville Jaguars also was a game in which the Cardinals gave up a lot of rushing yards. But you see that they used even fewer 8-man fronts, and they split pretty evenly between 6 or fewer or 7 people in the box. But even this one is a little bit deceptive. The Jaguars did not run effectively all game long. They really just had one outstanding quarter, the third quarter, in which they had a drive where they ran for 17 yards, 8 yards, 10 yards, 21 yards, play after play, until they ran it in for a 4-yard touchdown. But in the first quarter, the Cardinals' run defense actually did pretty well, getting tackles for loss on 6 or 7-man fronts. But ultimately, the Cardinals struggled and they gave up 132 yards rushing to the Jaguars running backs. Now, when we go on to the LA Rams game, this one is particularly interesting. On a yards per carry basis, the Rams ran the ball better than any other team the Cardinals have faced. But they only rushed it 16 times for a total of 99 yards for their running backs. Now, when they did run it, they were effective. for the entire game, every quarter. And this is in part because the Cardinals, as you can see, had no plays with 8 men in the box, and only a quarter of those defensive plays did they have 7 men in the box. That 75% of run snaps with 6 or fewer men in the box is the highest of any game this year by far. But when you look at all the running plays and how they played out quarter by quarter, what you see is that the game script led to the Rams abandoning the run. As you recall, the Cardinals blew out the Rams in this game, and they only ran the ball 5 times in the second half. They ran it effectively when they did, but at that point the Cardinals had enough of a lead that the Rams had to abandon the run. They were trying to get back in that game by passing the ball. So here you see a game where the Cardinals actually gave the Rams a favorable look in terms of the number of players in the box, and the Rams ran the ball well. But because they weren't able to keep pace with the Cardinals in terms of scoring, the Cardinals built up a lead, and the Rams had to give up the run. Now, the 49ers game is a really odd one. The 49ers ran for a lot of yards, but most of those yards were by quarterback Trey Lance. The running backs themselves actually ran the ball pretty effectively when they ran the ball. They averaged 5.7 yards per carry, had 11 carries for 63 yards. And all this with the Cardinals having a season-high 45.5% of their run defense snaps with 8 or more men in the box. The Cardinals were stacking the box to try to stop the run, but this is a credit to one of Kyle Shanahan's strengths. He's really good scheming up the run. But for whatever reason, the 49ers ran the ball mostly with their quarterback. Now, it's possible what was going on is that the Cardinals stacking the box led the 49ers to try to pass the ball to take advantage of that. And perhaps what happened is Lance, being a rookie quarterback, couldn't take advantage of those advantageous situations and ended up running the ball anyway. But there was something else that happened in this game that we'll come back to later. The Cardinals stopped the 49ers on multiple 4th and short attempts. This seems to be something the Cardinals are good at. Now, when we look at the Cleveland game, the Cardinals mixed up their fronts quite a bit against the Browns. And the Browns' ability to run was on script with these fronts. They ran well against the 6-man fronts, struggled against 7-man fronts, and couldn't do anything against 8-man fronts. In fact, when you look at the breakdown, you see that with 6 men in the box, they had 7 attempts for 52 yards and an average of 7.4 yards per carry. But against 7-man fronts, they averaged only 2.7 yards per carry. And on 8-man fronts, they were in the negative, averaging negative 1 yard per carry. Altogether, it seemed that the Cardinals were able to dictate how much running the Browns were able to do in terms of the fronts that they showed them. The Browns ran well when they had 6-man fronts, but they couldn't run against those stacked boxes. And as was the case in the Rams game, the Cardinals got a big lead, forcing a game script that made it difficult for the Browns to keep running the ball. Now, when we look at the Houston game, we see that the Cardinals overwhelmingly went with 7-man fronts and used those 8-man fronts sparingly and also reverted to 6-man fronts sparingly. And this was very effective against the Texans, which probably says more about how poor their offense is, starting a rookie quarterback and with the limited weapons they have on offense. In fact, they had only one run for over 6 yards, a 13-yard run by David Johnson. In general, this was the most dominant performance the Cardinals had in terms of stopping the run. But because of the lesser talent on the roster, it's not nearly as impressive as what they did in Tennessee. Finally, we get to the game against Green Bay. Now, the Cardinals had a pretty balanced look in terms of the fronts. They had 7-man fronts on just over half of the plays and split the rest pretty evenly between 6 or fewer or 8 or more fronts. And overall, the Packers ran the ball well. They put up 146 yards, though their yards per carry was lower than some of the other teams the Cardinals had faced at 4.7 yards per carry. But there's something we saw here from this Cardinals run defense. Despite their struggles throughout the game, they showed an ability to make a goal line stand when it mattered. And this is a pattern for the Cardinals. They've done a good job in terms of these goal line stands and stopping teams on 4th down. So this brings us back to that question. How is it that this Cardinals rush defense that is so poor in terms of yards it gives up per game and yards per rush average rates so well in terms of rush DVOA? Well, part of that answer is because DVOA weighs different rushing attempts differently. Giving up a 5-yard run on a 1st and 10 in the middle of the field isn't weighed as heavily in DVOA as giving up 5 yards on a 1st and goal. DVOA takes into account the importance of the situation, and in plays where it matters, like goal line stands, 3rd downs, 4th downs, the Cardinals' ability to make stops is buoying their DVOA. In fact, when you look, you see that the Cardinals have only given up 4 rushing touchdowns, which is tied for the 3rd fewest of any team in the NFL. Their 3rd down stop percent on defense is 2nd in the NFL, and their 4th down percent in terms of stopping teams is 1st in the NFL. They don't give up 3rd and 4th down conversions nearly as much as other teams. They have a stingy defense. So when you put this all together, what does it mean? Well, as cliche as this has become, the Cardinals' rushing defense is a bend but don't break defense. They'll give up yards. In fact, they'll play 6-man fronts and concede those yards. They'll let you get those running yards until you get to the red zone. Then they're going to put up those 7 and 8-man fronts, and they're going to get stingy, and they're going to stop the opposing team. Now, I need to say that being bad against the run isn't a good thing. The fact that this defense is struggling to make plays on the run if they don't have 7 and 8-man fronts is concerning. But when they do get those 8-man fronts, they are stout. And this defense, when it needs to, can stop the run. If the pass defense can continue to play well like it has, they can live with a run defense that gives up yards, as long as they're making stops in 3rd down, 4th down, and goal line situations. No team is perfect, and the Cardinals have some flaws. But if you have to pick an Achilles heel, run defense is a lot better than some of the alternatives. If you've enjoyed this video or found it informative, please do me a favor and click like. And also consider subscribing to my channel. I post Arizona Cardinals content every week, and I think you'll enjoy my content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Cardinal Rule.